So there are two reasons why I'm here. Number one, obviously, I got invited. Okay. Number two, I am the product of at least 3 generations in my family, both sides of the family, people that escaped from coup d'etats, rebellions, military takeovers, revolutions, civil wars, and they escaped towards democracy from Europe to the Caribbean, eventually to the United States. So thanks to their decisions, oftentimes heart-wrenching decisions to leave behind everything that they were familiar with, to leave behind their countries, their lives, that I'm here today talking about democracy. So as you may imagine, when I was a kid, dinner conversation was about dictatorship and democracy, how to prevent the former while protecting the latter. So I have made it part of my research to think about democracy and to think about the ways of perfecting the democracy that we live in, and particularly protecting it from what, since the turn of the century, has been this downward slide into what has been called illiberal democracy, which seems to be kind of a contradiction in terms. So I think that there are some very powerful, very interesting lessons that can be drawn from looking at case studies in Latin America, and that's the basis of my talk. The title comes from a quote from Governor Gavin Newsom from California, who said, and I quote, "Democracy is not a football. You don't throw it around. It's more like an antique vase." So think of democracy as this very valuable, beautiful antique vase that you have to be very careful with it. You smash it, you drop it, it will break into 1,000 pieces. But even cracks, may deter from its beauty and its utility, from its value, and you may even chip away very little at it until it becomes unrecognizable. And that is what we see nowadays, particularly in the last 40 years or so, when it comes to democracy. Rarely do we see the vase get smashed. That seems to be now a thing of the past. It's just this very slow destruction, very slow cracking, very slow erosion of democratic values until we get to a point where democracy is no longer recognizable. So violent takeovers, what my previous generations of my family, what my ancestors experienced, now it's pretty uncommon throughout the world. It is essentially the perversion of democracy until it becomes something that is illiberal and no longer recognizable. And I believe that Latin America provides key lessons, key case studies to understand what could happen to us. And actually, we are not at the front of the pack when it comes to democratic values and institutions. So why Latin America? First of all, major similarities. Oftentimes we think about democracy and we think about Europe, yet most European political systems are quite dissimilar from those in the United States of America. They tend to be more parliamentary democracies. Whereas in Latin America, we have over 20 nations, plenty of case studies with racial, class, gender divisions, geographical divisions, oftentimes quite similar to what you find in the United States. Also, we have republics in Latin America, presidential systems that are modeled precisely, exactly modeled after the institutions that we find in the United States. Some of the leading elites of Latin America copied, almost sometimes word by word, the US Constitution. Okay? Also, more recently in Latin America, as in the United States, as in Europe, we have seen declining levels of public trust in institutions like the courts, Congress, armed forces, law enforcement, and of course that leads, and it's also a component of a rising political polarization. Okay. Now, we can only take these cases to a certain level of comparison because there are some significant differences that actually make some Latin American institutions more democratic than those in the US. First, no electoral college. Okay? We are the only nation in the world that still uses the Electoral College to elect the same person that happens to be the head of government and the head of state. Okay? There are some electoral colleges out there, some other cases, but not a single one of them elects the head of state and the head of the government with the Electoral College. So in Latin America, as is the case throughout most of the democratic world, popular vote at the national level gets to elect the president. And they even had runoff elections in many cases, which we see sometimes at the state and local level in the US, meaning that if there's several viable candidates, there's an election, and if no one gets 50%, then there's a runoff election with the 2 top contenders, and that way a majority is assured. Also, senators in most countries in Latin America are elected by proportional representation. No 2 senators per state, or 2 senators or 1 senator per state or for province. So senators represent the people directly. There's no lopsided representation when it comes to the Senate. We have multi-party systems in Latin America rather than the traditional historic two-party system in the US. And then on the flip side of the coin, in Latin America, one of the major obstacles is this long-standing, deeply rooted authoritarian political culture that oftentimes hampers political compromises and agreements. So a couple of case studies, and I'm going to start with the first one because it's the old story of Latin America and the breakdown of democracy. Chile in 1973, that's General Augusto Pinochet in his Sunday best. Actually, he's in church there. He's in the cathedral just a few days after a military coup d'etat headed by the Chilean armed forces not only destroyed democracy in Chile, but also ended up with the death of the democratically elected president Allende. And that is going to lead to a 17-year-long military dictatorship in Chile until finally their elections to a new constitution. And there's a resounding note on behalf of the Chilean people to the military government. So that's a thing of the past. The present is here. And notice most of the dates are from the turn of the century. Venezuela, in which a populist candidate, Hugo Chavez, takes advantage of a two-party system in which they take turns milking the cow of government, slicing the bacon both ways. He gets elected, very quickly uses his majority to modify the Constitution. He stacks the judiciary. He takes the Supreme Court, and he will increase the number of justices to 32. Okay? So he has a super majority in the Supreme Court. So once he gets that, whatever laws are passed, they will never be challenged in the Supreme Court. He will manipulate the electoral authorities to his advantage, getting himself reelected and reelected. The only thing that gets him out of the political game is cancer. He died, but then he gets to handpick his successor. So at some point, there are no effective checks and balances or separation of powers in Venezuela. And that happens little by little in just a matter of a few years. And Venezuela, keep in mind, had one of the longest democratic traditions in Latin America. The case of Bolivia is an interesting one because here race is the wedge that divides the population, and is that manipulated race and class by populist leader Evo Morales to get elected. Same script, he will modify the Constitution, get a supermajority in Congress, stack the Supreme Court, and then he will extend his rule into a fourth term. Even though it was a two-term presidential system, he modifies the Constitution, gets the Supreme Court to rule in his favor, to extend it into a third term, tries for a fourth term, even though it's illegal, and gets the Supreme Court to say that it's not, and then finally he gets ousted. The flip side of that high level of presidentialism is Peru, where you have a very powerful Congress that has gotten into the habit lately of impeaching the president. So in just 5 years, Peru has had 6 presidents, because whenever the president, his honeymoon is over, then the president gets impeached by Congress, and there's a new interim president, and another one, weakening the institutional stability of the system. And then the most recent case is Guatemala, where a popularly elected president, Arevalo, 58% of the popular vote, now it's in doubt whether he will actually be able to take the oath of office, because his victory is being questioned by a very corrupt establishment, by the traditional elites of Guatemala, and that has led to massive protests in the streets of Guatemala as we speak. So, what goes on? What are the cracks in the vase? What is what I call the authoritarian playbook? And it's so consistent in country after country, culture after culture. It's just like a script that you can predict what is the ending of this play. First, you plant the seeds of doubt. Okay? You plant in the minds of people doubts about the system. You question the legitimacy of the system, of institutions, of individuals, except for your own legitimacy. Okay? Everything is corrupt, except for you, the candidate. Okay? Then you promise heaven on earth, that you're going to be the defender of the people, that this is an existential battle between good and evil, between the people and domestic, oftentimes foreign enemies, and you're the only one that can slay the dragon. Then you take a wrecking ball to the system once you're in power. You undermine traditional institutions, you replace them, or you use them in ways that they should not be used against your political enemies. And right after you do that, you remake those institutions. You stack them with your friends, with your acolytes, with your supporters, just like, for example, Hugo Chavez did with the Supreme Court in Venezuela. That way you pervert the mission of those institutions. And then finally, you consolidate power all in your person, checks and balances, separation of powers just goes out the door. What is the result then? What we call illiberal democracies. They still bear the name democracy, they still hold elections, they still have so-called democratic institutions, but it's just like a house of cards. Sorry for the redundancy, but oftentimes in political science we say that these are institutions that lack institutionalization. That is, there's the building, there's the bureaucrats, there are the rules and the procedures, but it's just a figment of our imagination. Essentially, everything is rubber stamped to do whatever the leader wants to do. So how do we deal with that? Famous quote by feminist Jane Addams, the cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. So rather than wrecking the system that we complain about, we go about and we fix it. So what have we learned from Latin America, or what can we learn from Latin America? Well, there are a few rules that we can follow. There are a few measures that we can take here to strengthen our democracy. The first one is handle it with care. Be very careful what you do when you are in power or out of power. The first one is to accept your rivals as legitimate contenders, okay? They are no enemies in politics. They are just opponents. I will always remember the character of the late John McCain back in 2008 when he was asked by an old lady at a presidential rally about Barack Obama, and the old lady called Barack Obama an Arab, and then he just grabbed the mic from her and said, no, he's a decent family man. We just differ on politics and the policies that we propose to lead this country into. So accepting your political rivals as legitimate rather than dehumanizing them, okay, criminalizing them, is key to maintain a democratic dialogue, to maintain the stability of institutions, and to be able to forge compromise. You cannot forge a compromise with someone that you feel that is not at your level, that is not even seen as a human being. Obviously, setting precedents can be very dangerous. If you abuse power, you can bet that once you're out of power, others will abuse that same power against you. So be very careful about how you use power. Even sometimes you have to bite your tongue and not say certain things or not take certain measures. Prudence and restraint, are key to maintaining that balance. Even though sometimes your followers are urging you to take action, to punish them, sometimes restraint is the way to go. Okay? And then finally, elections. Okay? We don't need to have perfect elections, but we need to have elections that are good enough and that are recognized as being so. So defending democratic electoral results is key to maintaining democratic stability. Oftentimes, if you question that, pretty much everything starts going down the drain. Obviously, protecting institutions, one of the key moves in the authoritarian playbook is to undermine and pervert institutions. The judicial branch is key to democracy. Oftentimes, it's the last obstacle standing in the way of people that are there to pervert and subvert democracy. It is the guardrails of democracy. They tend to rein in the excesses of elected politicians. Same for law enforcement, same for the military. The military and law enforcement should never get into the political fray. If you move them into that direction, you never know what is going to happen. It's a very dangerous, slippery slope. And of course, it's not part of government, but it's oftentimes called the fourth branch of government. The fourth power is a free press. An independent, free press that cannot be manipulated by the government is key to put fire to the feet of elected leaders and hold them accountable to the public. And then finally, oftentimes, when we talk about democracy, we don't talk about political elites because, it's not very democratic or egalitarian. But political elites are key, to the maintenance of the rules. It is elites that must defend, these political elites, the leaders of parties, the chairpersons, that must defend democratic institutions, that should stand up and say, no, what you're doing is wrong, and I'm not going to go ahead with it. Otherwise, by their silence, they undermine the system, and eventually they undermine themselves, as we have seen in other places. So, for example, in Venezuela, those people that didn't stand in the way of Hugo Chavez, that actually in some cases enabled Hugo Chavez, eventually were some of the ones that ended up paying with their political careers when Chavez was able to consolidate himself in power. Oftentimes they're called the useful fools that enable these populists to get into power. Elites also play the role of gatekeepers. Okay? Elites determine who gets into the game if they have paid their dues, if they are unfit, to be elected to office and prevent outsiders from gaming the system. So one of the, I would say, the paradoxes of the more we have democratized certain institutions like primaries, the more level the playing field, the more the chance for outsiders to game the system, okay? And then finally, there's the issue of agreements and compromises. Oftentimes, elites play the role of seeing farther than the people. Oftentimes, the people can be swayed one way or the other. It is elites that need to see the big picture, particularly when it comes to the protection of minorities from what is called oftentimes the tyranny of majority rule. So, in summary, I would like to quote Winston Churchill when he said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. It is a bad form of government, it's an imperfect form of government, but it's precisely in those imperfections of democracy that we have room for improvement, okay? It is, democracy excels through its faults, okay? Because we always, the people, through our elected representatives, always have the chance, the room, the leeway to improve on those institutions versus electing or allowing someone that promises that they are the only ones that can fix it. And eventually, even the best government is, if it goes unchecked, it's going to go down the slippery slope to an abuse of power to becoming a tyrannical regime. So, like they said back in the 19th century, eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. Thank you so much.